Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the Sy Syms School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harary. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Founders Dilemmas podcast. I'm Charlie Harary, here with you on all the different issues that we've been talking about here, business-related. I am joined with Dean Noam Wasserman. Dean, what do you have for us today?
Hey, hello, Charlie. Great to see you again. Always fun to do another round of Q&A. We're going to do a question that we got from a devoted listener. Thank you, Natasha, for this question. In startups with young founders, it is common to pivot and to change strategies frequently and constantly before giving them enough time to see them through. Do you see this as an issue? How significant is it? How much time should be given before making a change?
That's a great question. That's a really good question.
Yeah, so let's just get into a little bit of the details around the core word that Natasha used there, pivoting. It wasn't in the entrepreneurial lexicon too much until about 15 years ago. It became very popularized by lean startup, a bunch of the ways that you can approach being able to do the product development, be able to bring a little bit of structure, scientific approach to being able to design tests and being able to see what the results of those tests are, where they lead. Depending on when you do a hopefully well-designed initial pilot, initial experiment, whether if it goes badly, you should abandon it, whether you should pivot, the word that Natasha was using, and we can get to a little bit of where that metaphor comes from, whether you should maintain what you were doing or whether you should scale it, that it's ready for prime time, that you've hit product market fit and are ready to do the scaling. The word comes from a basketball metaphor. If you think about when you have a basket, the basketball on the court, you stop dribbling and then you can pivot. You can move around with the ball, but you have to keep one foot in place. So it's not that you're completely changing what you are doing, it's that you're having some kind of grounding in what you are keeping, but then you are open to any of the other changes that might be good for getting into a better position. And so that's where the pivoting metaphor is coming from. And that's what for startups, what do we keep as our core, but what can we change in order to better hit the market? And we've seen some examples of this throughout our first couple of seasons. We had back when we were talking about Tim with the Music Genome Project, when we were talking about persisting, and he was an example of over persistence. And some of the things he maybe should have read as signals from the market that he had to adjust. Should he be doing it in kiosks? Should he be doing it in a variety of other ways rather than just being a music site that he would be doing it? And so the over persisting rather than pivoting and being able to find what you're doing. We might have an upcoming episode where we'll get into a famous baseball pitcher, Curt Schilling, who founded a high-tech startup when he was leaving baseball. And some of the key things that led to that becoming a failure were the inability to pivot because he was so passionate about the original idea. And so essentially the unwillingness to pivot being its downfall. And so several other ones that we'll get into in terms of those. But Charlie, let's first get some of your thoughts on it, and then we'll have a little bit more of a deeper case study and then some data, some of the conceptual things that will apply from what we've done to this question.
I think, listen, I totally agree, and I think some of the hard parts about founders, especially younger founders or some of the younger companies, is there's a tendency to jump into this world. There's a tendency to want to be an entrepreneur and to jump into this space. I remember when I was teaching entrepreneurship at Sy Syms, the class was packed. I mean, people want to be entrepreneurs. It's the new cool thing. And I was telling the students, like, when I grew up, like, there was like one kid in the entrepreneurship class because he didn't know what to do, and being a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant didn't fit, right? So there's a certain, people need to realize that and we spoke about this on previous episodes, that there is a certain excitement to feeling like you can, hit the ball over the fence and, achieve the stardom and the fame and the riches that you're reading about in all the videos and all the podcasts and all the stuff that you're reading. And what happens, people, is they jump in and they don't really have the idea fully baked, or they do a little bit, but not really. And then as they hit their first wall, there's a cool term called pivot, which is now an acceptable way of either shutting the business down and recreating it, or making major shifts, and that becomes the thing that they do. So it's really important that there's a difference between some of the things we've been learning here, which, let's assume, to use the word pivot, there's a micro pivot, right? I have a product, but the market reacts this way, and let me shift it a little bit this way, and I thought I would distribute it this way, but I'm really distributing that, which I think is a normal evolution of anything you're doing, right? You don't really know anything until you do it, and then once you learn, if you don't really make adaptations, you're not going to survive, versus the pivot as the excuse for soft, rushed thinking. And I think that distinction is a major difference in how people are using it.
Yeah, and in general, the approach to experimentation has been a critical part of what you're highlighting. I was just talking yesterday with a founder, excuse me, who talked about the way in which he went big. We had passion for our idea. We were building the full thing. We were introducing it all at once, and how that was the downfall of why it didn't go well. And so being able to bite a small piece, being able to learn from it, iterate on it, pivot if necessary in the ways that you're learning and things like that. That's one of the key insights that was coming from Lean Startup and the way to approach it. On the other side of it, there's a quote that I heard a few years ago that I think captures the downside, that pivot is just a new term for failure.
Yeah.
And so there's all sorts of ways in which we have to think a little bit more clearly about what signals is the market sending to us and what are we going to do to that. The other thing that you're pointing to is a tendency to jump in with the idea and the passion that we talked about even in our first episode. Yeah, passion for the idea versus passion for becoming a founder. If you're having a passion for becoming and for the idea, you're going to be less likely to be open to why it's wrong. You're going to be looking for confirming signals. You're going to be looking for what is everything that's telling me that this is going right. Versus if you have the passion for becoming a founder, we talked about some of the downsides of that, but some of that is that you might be open to, I'll still be able to become a founder if I'm adjusting my idea. I'm not so wedded to the idea itself. I'm wedded to being able to make this into the career direction that I want to go in. And so it also has some echoes a little bit of the passion to become a founder versus the passion for the idea. Just to bring in one case that I find an intriguing one. This is the beginnings of Instagram. Instagram actually started off with an idea that was called bourbon. Kevin Systrom was the original founder of it. And what he did, he came up with something, this bourbon product, this app, where people could check in at a location. They can earn points for hanging out with their friends. They can post some pictures of their meetups and things like that. And unfortunately, it wasn't taken off. For one thing, it was a more complex product than he was expecting, than people were expecting, than what they were wanting. It was essentially a bigger product than it should be. And one of the key things of Lean Startup is starting with what's called a minimum viable product. And he went beyond that. He had a whole bunch of bells and whistles and other things like that. People were not using at all their check-in features. However, they built analytics into the product, fortunately. And when they would take a look at the analytics, they would see not check-in, but people are using the app sharing, the photo sharing within the app. They're using those features. And so when he saw that, they essentially chopped everything else out of bourbon, except for the photos, and there's a commenting feature and like features and stuff like that, but all focused on the photos part of it. And that's when they got back into being able to see, this is what the market wants. Let's strip away all the other things that we have here. And when Kevin was talking at a conference about a decade ago and reflecting on this, he said, you're going through false starts. Bourbon was a false start. The best companies in the world have all had predecessors. YouTube was a dating site. You always have to evolve into something else. And if you're too taken with your idea, it's going to cause problems for it. There's another one, a comment that I saw from the CEO at Exclusible. He was commenting on one of the most important lessons of Instagram success is that the founders didn't waste time trying to save their original idea. And so all of this comes together to help us understand a little bit of the biases that we've talked throughout about the being wedded to your idea, the passion for it, and being much more open to being able to see where it might not be working. In terms of academia, this is a relatively new area of research. This is actually one of the places, there's a bunch of times that academia leads practice, like when you start making inroads into being able to understand some things, and then it starts spreading to the world of practice. This is one where practice is leading academia. And so a bunch of the things that now are pioneered by Eric Ries and by Steve Blank when they're talking about the lean startup foundations that they were building and things like that. And now we're having some of the research that's being done within academia on this. But unfortunately, a lot of academia is taking it as a strategic issue. They think that pivoting is about strategy. And I see it, this might not surprise you or our listeners, I see it as at least as much of a people issue. It's at least as much of a founding team and the other people involved issue, because when you have the team and you're looking at being able to change your idea and what you're going to pursue, you're going to be constrained by who you have on board, what their skills are, and therefore what you might be able to do. If you're pivoting into something that is outside of the team's capabilities, or you're considering a pivot, if the market is pointing to that you should head into something that is outside of the team's capabilities, that might make you hesitant to do the best strategic pivot because your team is not going to be suited to be able to do it. And vice versa, if you pivot and now someone on your team is obsolete, they used to be a pretty central player, a founder who was bringing something to the table, say that there was skills in business to business, and now you're heading into business to consumer. You're B2C, very different skills compared to B2B. That might cause all sorts of tensions within the team as that person is now obsolete, as you maybe put in place an equity split that was assuming that person is going to be a continuing player within the team. And so a lot of the things that we've talked about on the people side, that this pivot question could become a constrained by it, or it could become a real heightening of tensions because of what you're doing within the team. And so considering both the people and the product are critical for you to do when you're looking at the pivots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just jotting down notes as you're talking, and maybe just to fire just a couple at our listeners here. Like you said, the first thing you have to realize is that you have to be product central. I think people sometimes are passionate more about the popularity than the product, and they get excited for numbers like millions. I see this a lot of times when it comes to content. People get excited for videos to reach millions of views, and they forget that what's actually reaching millions is not who they are. And I've spoken to a whole bunch of people that are in the content space who hit the millions and then wake up and go, what did I become? Because they were so focused on popularity. And what you said earlier, which is critical, is if you're really product driven and there's a passion for the product, you're not married to the original idea, you're willing to make changes, you're willing to figure out what works, you're less concerned about the race for popularity. And that's a critical difference, I think, in how you build something and how ultimately that thing becomes the right thing for you. But there's two things I just think we should think about in what you're saying, and maybe for our listeners just to consider. The first thing is just to comment on the last thing you said, really, is the pivoting, right? Which is really the people issue. People make this mistake a lot. They tie people into the product pivot, and as a result, they don't get the right answer. Right? And you have two people on your team, like you said, who really aren't B2C types, or really not product types, and they really do like this or do like that, or in the whole groupthink starts to block the truth, which is we should really move in this direction. And so whenever anyone who's listening, whenever you're going through a pivot, try to separate people from product. Try to like almost look at it like, forget who's in the room. What's the right thing that we should do for this product? Then when you have the truth, you have the answer, then you go back to your people. And this is what we said earlier, for those who are tuning in now, go to the earlier episodes where we cover people issues, right? We cover issues of making quick decisions about equity splits and being too soon about giving away ownership. This is a real impact. When you have to make a pivot, it's hard when the person who's not going to survive, who doesn't make it through the pivot, owns half of your business. And so this is a key impact about when you have a company, when you're creating a company, to be careful about who you give equity to, and to maybe look at other measures, other gifts like profit sharing versus equity splits, so that later on, should you have to make changes, the people that may not be part of the future don't own half your company. But the one thing that I want to sort of mention here as well, and I think this gets lost, is the amount of thought that goes into these things by CEOs. We know this sort of intuitively, but we don't know this sort of like emotionally, that great CEOs really spend a lot of time thinking. They don't just jump. I'll tell you two quick anecdotes. I was once talking with David Lichtenstein, who started a company called Lightstone, a big real estate company. and we were talking about some project he wanted me to help him with. And at the end of the day, we were doing this, and I was sort of racing in my head through stuff. And he looked at me and he goes, "Remember," and I'll never forget this. He goes, I think it was his father taught him or someone. He goes, but it was his mantra for life that I really was taken by. He says, "Remember, always measure it twice, because you only want to cut once." Right? Slow down on your thinking. Measure it twice, because you only want to cut once. And that way of thinking, of just be more deliberate, think about it again. Scott Reckler, the CEO of RXR, massive, multi-billion-dollar company. He every year takes a month. He's a CEO of a big company, and he dedicates January to writing a white paper. It's an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of conversations with people, because he wants to know where the market's going. So it's important that if you're listening to this and you're quick in your actions, don't be quick in your mind. Remember, some of the greatest CEOs, really, even further on in their careers, are still taking the time to think, to do some research, because they don't want to have to end up cutting twice. And that's an important piece, I think, to the whole game here.
Yeah, so a couple of echoes of what you were talking about. One is the first episode that we started off with, my favorite quote from dear departed Steve Jobs, alav shalom, follow your heart, but check it with your head. And so the measuring twice, the pulling back on the reins, not just following the gut and the instinct, but being able to see, are there metrics? Are there things that we're not thinking about right now that by diving in, we're going to be neglecting to be taken care of? One of the other ones, founder that I worked with when I did one of my Harvard case studies on, named Barry Knowles, CEO of a major telecom, founder, CEO of a major telecom, used to carve out and defend with his life thinking hour every week. He would set aside on his calendar that he'd be able to have that hour to do a bunch of the reflecting, a bunch of the putting out the periscope, because otherwise it's nose to the grindstone a lot of times, especially as a founder. And so being able to think a little bit more deeply, a little bit more broadly during set times is something that he found very effective. Just to concretize a little bit of what you're talking about, it also gets into at what point in the startup, and this gets to one of Natasha's questions around it, some of the things that are going to constrain you or enable you when you're thinking about these. So if you have built your team and then the idea is changing, that a lot of times is going to constrain your choice of ideas. You're going to force fit it into the existing team's capabilities. Versus if you have the idea, you hone it, you find a way to be able to do a little bit more, whether it's the king approach, whether it's that you keep it, very much within, as if you have the luxury of time and a bunch of the other things that we talked about during some of those early episodes. If you hone the idea first, and then you start building your team, then you can create a checklist of the needed capabilities given the idea. You can then fit the team's capabilities to what's needed for the idea. And so it's a very different approach that you can take depending on whether you brought people on maybe a little bit too early, a little bit before the idea was going to do a major pivot, and thinking a little bit more about what's going to happen when we pivot, when you're starting to build the early team, is a critical thing to add into some of the things that we've been talking about throughout this.
What's interesting, just jump on this for a second, I want to get your opinion on this. I find that there's a natural tension here. Entrepreneurs require a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of relentlessness. A lot of times entrepreneurs, buck the trend. And there seems to be in that personality trait this desire to be thinking and doing and doing and thinking. Like there's a quickness. And I think entrepreneurs end up thinking that, as opposed to thinking the whole thing through, which is going to take way too long, let me bring in people around me. And so I feel like there really is that tension where it's almost within the entrepreneur's personality to create scenarios that are going to ultimately bring their demise. And I think it's critical they listen to what we're saying, and then specifically what you just said a second ago, which is a lot of times the quickness. You assume, I got a friend of mine who's really can do this. We should do this together, so I don't have to really think about it, or I don't have to do the stuff that I hate to do. Right? You're constantly trying to adapt for your weakness when you're an entrepreneur, because you're moving too quickly to start building up your left hand, which is maybe a good idea, but if it's too early, you end up laying the seeds that comes later on to hurt you.
Yeah, and so this is part of, I think, one of the goals that we've had throughout the podcast is helping people understand the longer term implications of what they're doing now. There's some of the things that are easy to hit the undo key on, easy to pivot away from. a lot of the other things that we've been talking about, the people problems and other things like that you caused yourself early on, far harder to pivot, far harder to hit the undo key when it comes to you involve someone early and in the wrong way, and giving you a little bit more of the insight into the longer term and being able to back into, in Hebrew, what we call the sof ma'aseh v'mashav tchila, that the actions you can take later, put in the time now to think through which ones are going to be the harder to change and therefore devote more attention to those. When you're talking about some of the tensions specifically to this that we're looking at here, you might be improving product market fit with your product as you are pivoting, as you're learning and other things like that, adjusting it. But are you harming the founder product fit?
Yep.
And that's where it's going to come back to cause problems for you. If it makes a founder obsolete, if you had the equity that you split in the wrong way and that person is now going to be dead equity, variety of other things that are going to make you think twice, you might take a worse strategic approach. You might have a different way that you're approaching the product in a suboptimal way because of the people part of it. And it gets into also one of the simplest framework that we've talked about, the need, the can, and the want. And being able to think through the market need, what can we do? What do we want to do? When you have that market need is actually understood a little bit better, that could change the can, that could change the want, and being able to have a little bit more of the foresight around that. Just some reflections for you. I was getting into some of this discussion with someone recently, and I was also asked by the major conference of business school professors to talk about this in their August conference. Universities are not thought of as entrepreneurial. Universities are very slow moving, and there's a lot of other problems that they have in terms of being able to adjust to the market, being able to make sure the product is going to fit what's needed and other things like that. But at YU, fortunately, we've been able to foster over the last few years a lot more of lean startup becoming our mantra and things like that, where we've been able to create potentially high impact experiments, pilot them, learn from them, see if they should be scaled, if they should be maintained, if they should pivot, or whether it should be abandoned. And there's all sorts of things within Sy Syms alone that exist now that if not for our being able to take this approach, but also being able to keep in mind the people that we had on board and how we might be able to adjust, how we might be able to tap their skills even better with a pivot. Those are some of the things that we've been able to do. And so I would number at least a dozen major new pilots that we've done, a lot that are scaling now, lessons that are extending to our new projects. Something that we started back in COVID to help solve our students' problems with getting summer jobs. That's something that every college student had across the country, not being able to get summer jobs when COVID hit. We created something we called the YU Consulting Force. We learned from that initial pilot about how to be able to fine tune it and be able to have it really hit the market. We extended it to Israel. We then did a pilot in Israel, took the Israel Summer Internship Program and did that there. That has now scaled to being about 30 students this past summer. A new asynchronous MBA program that began as 2 courses that we piloted and then proved that we could do some very sophisticated online education worldwide. Israel Semester Abroad pilot that we're doing right now, something that they call the Polish Project to teach our students professionalism and other things that are going to gear them up when the career realm. That's become a building block of our new business curriculum, business communications curriculum, lots of others. And so one of the key things that we've been able to do is take this mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset, around piloting, pivoting, scaling, and being able to apply that even to a university. And so if we can do it within a university, you can imagine how much if people can take a lot of the fundamentals, be able to incorporate the people side and the product together, how much power you might be able to have within your startups to do that.
Amazing. If anyone has any more questions, you can always reach out to us, foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com. Please feel free to send in any of your questions. Happy to address them here. As always, Dean, thanks so much for this episode. We have some more Q&As coming up into the next few episodes, so stick with us. Can't wait to see you next time.